Welcome to Halal Money Matters, sponsored by Saturna Capital. I'm Monem Salam, and this is a very special episode. It's our 50th one. That means I've probably been doing this for about close to 4 years now. It's been a great journey. So what we're going to do today, it's a second part series. We take the 401k matter in a completely different another angle about how to get your halal funds into your 401k. In this case, what we've done is I'm interviewing Haaris Syed, who filed a lawsuit against Los Angeles County with the help of Zeba Huq. I'm really excited to talk to them about their story of how Haaris went for years without taking any of his generous retirement matches, and how instead of giving up, he kept pushing and pushing Los Angeles County to be able to offer him an alternative based on religious accommodation. So Haaris Syed is a longtime public defender with Los Angeles County. And Zeba Huq is a civil rights attorney who at the time worked with him through Stanford's Religious Liberties Clinic. It's a really inspiring story, very practical conversation. Let's get started. So welcome Haaris and Zeba to Halal Money Matters. I'm really excited about it. I've actually never had two guests before, so this is going to be really, really great to do that. So, but thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So, as for our listeners, last time we actually spoke about putting, an Islamic investment option onto your 401k. And we gave an example of one company, GM, General Motors, that they used one tack to be able to go and actually appeal for it. And eventually they ended up getting a brokerage option within their 401k. Today, what I want to do is talk about maybe a different avenue to do that. It might not be something everybody wants to do, but it is an option that's available. So I wanted to make this more into a story. So Haaris, why don't you kind of start us off, if you don't mind, and really tell us exactly what happened from the very beginning. And then I might just jump in and ask questions. And Zeba, feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah. So I went to law school, didn't, again, believed not to take loans that bear interest, right? So I saved up money before I went to law school. When I got there, I was able to pay part of my tuition, took loans that don't accrue interest until 6 months after you graduate. Once I became 6 months after I graduated, fortunate enough to be able to borrow from family and several different family members to pay off those loans completely. But then I had to get a job to pay them back really quickly. So I worked in business litigation. It was a nice paying job, but in a year's time, I was able to pay back almost all the loans to family and friends. I only had my brother left, and he said he could wait. And so I ended up becoming a public defender. So it took less than half my salary to become a public defender, and because it felt like more meaningful work. And that was in 2005. And so as soon as I've been a public defender for 20 years now. But as soon as I joined, you have an option to join the 401k plan. They also have a 457B plan, which is a thrift plan for government employees. So there's both. And you get matching dollar for dollar, employer match dollar for dollar up to 4% on each plan of your salary. So it becomes a sizable amount. So I looked into it, and it turned out every investment option that they had in their plans had bonds in them. Let alone impermissible stocks as well.
Which is pretty much typical for most 401k plans that are out there. So, I mean, it's not something different, but yeah, go on. I just wanted to kind of mention that.
Yeah, it wasn't different even for my prior employer, right, that I had in a private side. It had a similar problem. But now here I am in the government and thinking, okay, I looked into it. I couldn't figure out an option. So then I just kind of got the public defender job. The stereotypes fit. It does become overwhelming, and you do get a lot of cases. And so I was just kind of like trying to stay above water. And so I wasn't thinking about my own finances. So, but fast forward about maybe 5 years later in 2010, I just had my second child. I was looking into buying a home through Islamic financing. And I just started looking into my finances a little bit more seriously. And then I realized, and around that time, I learned that the county had started offering. And I work in Los Angeles, and so I work for the Los Angeles Public Defender's Office. So I'm a county employee for Los Angeles. But around that time, LA County had started a self-directed brokerage account option for their deferred compensation plans. So I'm when I found out about that, I'm like, okay, sign me up. I drove to the distant city in LA that actually had the plan coordinator. I went there and it said, please, I want to sign up today. And so they said, okay, great. But you first need to meet the threshold of each plan first. And so each plan, the 401k and the 457, require $25,000 first. And anything above the $25,000, you can then invest in a self-directed brokerage account. And the theory is for that, it's kind of like a county playing mother, not wanting you to, for unexperienced investors to blow away their entire retirement, like be gambling in the market, perhaps. That's part of it. Sure. And the second part is that they want to be able to recover their third-party administrator fees and the county administrative fees that they have for operating the plan. And so there's this $25,000 limit, but I can't. That's my problem. Is I can't invest in those plans to get to $25,000 in the first place to then use what's after that. So what I did is I approached the county. I went to their PAC meetings, their Plan Administrative Committee. They put me on calendar for finally in February of 2011, and I presented my issue. In fact, as I was walking up the steps to get to the meeting, I ran into another Muslim person that I knew, and I told him why I was there, and he said, I have the same problem. And so he came along with another employee. He said, and there's several of us that have the same problem, and we're actually on the floor above where your hearing's taking place. And so I'm like, okay, why don't you come too? So they came also as they sat down. And so when I presented my issue, the PATH board members were receptive. They listened to the concern, and they took it under consideration, essentially. Fast forward a year later, I finally got word that they said that they put it on the agenda again. So exactly a year later, February of 2012, they said that they couldn't make the accommodation, and they gave several reasons. But essentially, getting rid of the requirement of $25,000 would prevent them from getting their administrative fees from everybody. And putting a new plan, which I had suggested to them, just put a new plan in place. And I suggested Monem mutual funds. I was talking to Awais Dadaboy at the time, and I continued talking to him, but through Amana, and he actually gave me the folders through Amana mutual funds that I could actually present to each of the board members when I went there the year before. But they said that it was just cost prohibitive for them to put in a new plan because there's not that many participants for this very narrow type of plan, and they didn't want to make a social equitable plan because then it's almost like a slippery slope. Like if everybody comes in with wanting their own individual plans, then it becomes they have the cost of administering it's difficult. So they looked into different options and said it's just not feasible for them.
So let me stop you for a second. So in this enterprise process, so far it's only you and the PAC, right? You didn't get other you didn't do a kind of like a rally cry for other Muslims and so on. This was between you and them. Okay.
Yeah, this is just between me and them. And then I said, well, then at the end of the meeting, they said, you know what? They'll look to see if do they have to make a religious accommodation, right? And then they gave me word, I don't know, a while later saying, I guess their attorney said, no, they don't have to. So then I buried my head in the sand again and just got busy with work again. And then in 2018, this is now, 13 years into the office, I finally started thinking of finances again. I finally got they put me in a supervisory position training new lawyers, and the commute alone gave me time to think about these things. So I started looking at finances and putting everything in order financially in place. I started reading all these books, like personal finance stuff, but they all start with get rid of your debt. Wasn't a problem for me. I had savings that I needed to use. And the first thing then is like, if your employer has a match, take the match, right?
Take advantage of it.
Exactly. Up to the maximum of the match the employer were doing. So all these books are saying this, and I just can't do it. So then I thought there's got to be a solution to this. So I reached out to the county again, but I also decided there's someone nationally has to have this problem. So I've put out a feeler to NAML, which is the National Association of Muslim Lawyers. They had a listserv. And so Muslim lawyers around the country someone's got to have this issue. So I put it out there to see if anybody can respond about that. And instead, I became the Debbie Downer. And then, because all of a sudden people started responding to me going, oh my God, I didn't know I was doing something sinful. I'm doing the same thing. And so, and I'm not getting any encouraging things. I just became like this, and it wasn't not my intention at the time. But one person from New Jersey, one lawyer, just replied very quickly with a one-liner and gave me a link to New York State's Deferred Compensation Board making a religious exemption. And so I'm like, that was encouraging. So I actually immediately called New York State Deferred Compensation Board and got in touch with people, and they gave me some information on the phone. And it was encouraging. And they had just done it in 2014. So this is like 4 years before. I find out 4 years after they've done it. And I get their information. So then I'm like, okay, I reach out to the county, and I tell them about New York State additional information. And they get back to me saying, because of system limitations, we can't do this. And I think they use a prior rationale because they looked into it in detail before, right? So then I'm like, okay, I think litigation might be the option. So I reach out to CARE National, Council on American Islamic Relations. And they put me in touch with someone local in Los Angeles. And that person put me in touch with Zeba and Stanford Law School's Religious Liberties Clinic. And from then on, they were instrumental in helping.
Yeah. So one thing I want to ask us, so Zeba, if you can jump in and really kind of explain as we're going forward, what is this religious exemption that Haaris just mentioned? Can you just briefly?
Yeah. So, I mean, just generally in civil rights law, in the area of religion, employers are required to accommodate employees for their religious practice, their religious observance, unless it would be what's usually called an undue hardship. There's been a lot of movement on what that means in the last few years, but this is common, right? And in my practice, a lot of what I would do is represent people who needed time off for their Sabbath on Saturday, or needed a dress or grooming accommodation, like needed to wear a beard and it was against the rule. And so, what happens is that someone asks for that accommodation, and the employer is required to evaluate under both federal and state law whether they can provide that accommodation or not. So in Haaris's case, he was asking for this accommodation in an area in which I think is not a typical area that employers are usually used to. And he did it over and over again, right? 2005, 2011, 2016, again in 2018. And when his accommodation request and the whole story came in front of our desk, it was a really interesting case. And it seemed like, particularly when we knew, I think in isolation, it was like, yeah, this seems really difficult. I certainly am not a finance expert or employment benefits expert, but the fact that New York had done it and styled it particularly as an exemption, essentially an accommodation, because what New York had was they had a self-directed brokerage option that would allow most employees to invest with a $10,000 threshold. Okay. But if you filled out a form or an affidavit, describing your religious beliefs, or I don't even remember exactly what that form was, they would drop that threshold down to 500. And that 500 threshold, from what we understand, I'm not sure that was publicly available, goes to fees, administrative costs, etc., right? Which is a huge difference for someone like Haaris or other Muslims who believe that, they shouldn't be dealing in interest or in impermissible funds. Well, when you have something like 500, you still are dealing in that for $500 potentially. But it's a lot easier to perhaps donate a certain amount to offset it, right? Versus the $25,000 limit that Haaris was looking at. And of course, he had two investment options, and most of his peers invested in both of them. So that was actually $50,000 that it would require of him. So when he came to us, we started looking deeper into the issue. And of course, like I said, my team was sort of expert. So we work, we're a team of lawyers, and we work with students. And the program is really intended to support individuals like Haaris trying to live their faith on the job or in other contexts. But we also teach students through the practice of law. So we teach them how to be lawyers through actually litigating. And so, I don't know, you probably met with 10 different students over the course of this litigation. But basically, we really had to figure out how do we do we have a viable legal claim here? And we did think that we did, but we didn't really understand the employment benefits context and some of the finance aspects of it. So we actually partnered with an employee benefits attorney who told us, look, this is the Los Angeles County is a huge employer, right? Like one of the largest employers in the country, much less the state. So they have a lot of leverage with their third-party administrators, right? So it's not, sometimes if you're a smaller employer, maybe that's going to be really difficult because, the third party who's administering these funds is just going to say, we're not going to allow more flexibility to you. They may, but Los Angeles County really had more sway. The arguments that they presented, I mean, Haaris talked about it in the 2012 sort of their responses to his accommodation request. They basically said that the 25,000 threshold was required to collect administration and third-party administrator fees. But I mean, from what we could tell, those fees were less than $100 a month or something like that. It was very low. So that it didn't really hold water. They argued the threshold was necessary to allow.
It's like $5 on one plan and like $8 on the other per month.
Yeah, it was something minimal.
Right, small. Cool.
Yeah. And then they also argued that the threshold was required to allow only knowledgeable investors to enroll in this brokerage window and the self-directed fund, which, of course, having a certain amount of money doesn't actually really indicate whether you're a knowledgeable investor or not. They also argued that it would be, I think Haaris mentioned that this is really just for a few participants and perhaps is, this sort of fear of it being a slippery slope that everyone's going to come and ask for their own, core option. Because we can talk about the brokerage window, but there's also the option of them adding sort of a core option to their lineup, right? They had, 3 options or so. And they said, well, that's, going to be a problem. And they also said that it would, adding a core option would be confusing and lead to ineffective investor behavior, whatever that means. So a lot of these things, when we talked to the expert that we brought in on employee benefits, she was saying, look, this is very sort of paternalistic behavior, right? They're sort of saying, we just really want to control who gets to self-direct through a brokerage window and direct their funds the way they want to. We want to be able to control most employees' investment for their retirement funds. And of course, you may know more about this than I do, but of course, there's certain fiduciary responsibilities of these plan administrators in order to make sure that they're, shepherding and caring for those funds in a responsible way, right? So that, like we may have seen in other instances where pensions are sort of somehow, whittled down because of bad administration. So there was this fiduciary duty argument that kind of kept coming up. And again, our employment benefits expert was telling us, hey, this is not, of course, there is a fiduciary duty, but the fiduciary duty does not require a $25,000 threshold. And of course, over here, we have New York, which is showing us an example of the fact that they have been able to successfully implement for, I don't know, it was 5+ years before we really got involved, a plan in which you could accommodate a religious employee.
This is a common one that I hear, which is about the fact that, if we open up for Muslims, this will open up the floodgates for any religious person to come in and say whatever they want to do. We have their favorite fund to be in there. Is that a legitimate argument? How did you argue against that aspect of it, or did you?
So first of all, slippery slope arguments are always a logical fallacy, right? Like you can't, deny, you can always sort of deny one person by saying like, if we give you this, then everyone else is going to come along and ask for it. So that's sort of problematic under the law as well. It's generally not regarded as an act, as a argument that's credited and a valid argument. But I think that argument really only applied to the idea of a core fund, right? And it is a little more challenging. I think perhaps, there are some employers who maybe have a choice of, maybe you have 10 different funds or, there's a large variety. I think in LA County's case, they had 3 funds and they were very, they were more narrow. They weren't specialized in any way. So I think that argument for them seemed compelling to say, well, if we're going to add this Sharia compliant fund, then what about, the environmental group that's going to say they want this, et cetera. Well, first of all, my response to that is, well, the law, both statutory as well as constitutional law, has special protections for religion, number one. So other groups aren't necessarily going to have the same rights to this as you would as a protected class, as a religious person. But number two, the other option was, we can talk about core funds, but the easiest way in some ways to allow for this accommodation is just to make it easier for your employees to self-direct their funds through a brokerage window and access directly the Sharia compliant fund like Amana or others. So although both of them were presented in our litigation and our lawsuit, so we did end up, I'm not sure if we said, but we actually took on Haaris as a client and we sued the county and the plan administrators for religious discrimination and non-accommodation under federal and state statutes, as well as the Constitution. And then we also alleged violations of fiduciary duty under state and local law. And
so let me stop here for a second. Just before we go here further into this, just one or two questions. So, Haaris was working for a governmental institution, right? It was LA County. It was doing that. And a lot of employees are working for private companies. As we're going down this road, does it matter really whether it's a public versus a private institution, or this could apply generally, you think, to everybody?
Yeah. So the only piece that really matters is that we had a constitutional claim because it was a government, right? The Constitution applies to the government in particular, but these statutory laws, particularly Title VII of the Civil Rights Act or California Fair Employment and Housing Act, these are all statutory laws that apply to private employers as well. So we had kind of an extra bow in our quiver, because we had the constitutional argument as well. But there are things that are broadly available to private employees. Private employers are also required to abide by these civil rights laws and accommodate religious employees. So these claims, fell under sort of two buckets, which was the religious discrimination or non-accommodation, and then the other bucket was the fiduciary duty. The idea of a fiduciary duty. Now, that wasn't really my wheelhouse. That was our co-counsel who was the employment benefits expert. But essentially, in order to start any litigation as an employee, you have to first go to administrative agency and file there. So that's really where we started. And Haaris, he's probably a pretty atypical employee who is willing to engage in this process for a few reasons. One, he had this really strong and very unwavering belief, right, that he could not invest in non-Sharia compliant options. And over the course of 15 years had consistently asked, been rejected, and still stayed true to his beliefs, at huge personal disadvantage because he was losing out, on 8% of match from both of those funds. Basically his tax deferred savings, the employer matching, and investment gains over the course of 15 years, which is a lot.
That's quite a bit. I mean, it's
quite a bit.
Quite a lot of money. Like you're talking about like your 401k and your 457 both growing, and you're not being able to save on the taxes for putting the money in. All of those things really compound. But before we go on, Zeba, just one quick question for Haaris. I mean, I know that in this particular case, Haaris, you decided to go the litigation route, right? And maybe partly has something to do with the fact that you're a lawyer and doing that. But a lot of people, if I told somebody, hey, why don't you sue your employer for something that you want, they're gonna be like, oh my God, I'm gonna get fired. I don't want to do that. So what was your thought process in doing this? So like, were you ever nervous about going down this road or those things?
Yeah. Los Angeles County is it's a large governmental agency, right? And so I'm just the public defender's office is one small agency within this and big umbrella. And then also the fact that, as public defenders, we're fighters anyways, right? We're fighting the government every day in court. Although we're government employees paid by the government, we're kind of paid by the government to poke it in its eye every day. And so, It being a contrarian is not unusual in that sense, but with Zeba and the Stanford Law School's Religious Liberties Clinic, we had to go through a complaint process first internally. When we did it with the EEOC, all of a sudden I was getting they set up a meeting with me for the county policy of equity. It's basically, had to go through the internal processes first, First off, I didn't know why I was being investigated. I'm like, I didn't do anything to anybody. What happened? And so, but when I showed up, I realized, oh, this is my own complaint about religious discrimination because with the EEOC. Okay. So it was once you pass it in, it had no bearing by my office. It was just like check the box for them, and move the paper forward to the EEOC.
And then Zeba, from your perspective, if somebody did decide to do this from a private employee perspective, is there any protections for them from not being fired while they're going through this or not? Or
There's absolutely civil rights protections against employer retaliation for making claims at the EEOC or in other contexts. But the practical reality is exactly what you said, Monem, which is that most employees are not going to be willing to sue their employer. There's just too much risk involved. And that's also, the second point, which you also touched on. So the first point was that he was really extraordinary as a plaintiff in terms of the fact that his sincere belief was so strong for 15 years. He had lost out on really hundreds of thousands of dollars of compensation and gains. But second, the fact that he was an attorney, and as he just described, a public defender, he sort of had a confidence in the system, right? And the fact that his employer was governmental, I think, also changes some of the stakes and some of the, some of the approach, right? As a governmental entity, there's generally a lot of attorneys, on staff who are very conscious of their obligations under, the law, including the Constitution. So I think it was dealt with in a way that was quite professional, and they took it seriously without retaliation. I don't think Haaris really felt any retaliation from it, but it's not irrational for employees to be frightened to engage in this kind of challenge to their current employer, whether in the private sphere or in public service, because it's not easy to do that. Like I said, Haaris was exceptional, but once we went down that path, we started at the agency, which is that's a whole process. I think it took maybe even over a year or close to a year to go through that process, and then after that, we were able to file in federal court, and to be honest with you, the negotiations with Haaris's employer and the county started from day one, essentially, right? Like once we filed with at the EEOC and at the administration, there was definitely the attorneys came out of the woodwork, and we started those conversations. But of course, if you could just make this happen by talking to your employer, then we would be in a much better place. And it is great when there are employers who are receptive and employees are able to organize and bring this change about short of litigation. That's the goal, right? That's the best thing that you can do, or that's the best situation.
And did you, from this point on, did you now think to yourself, oh, I'm sure there's other Muslim employees that are in the LA County. Should we get all of those people together and do this? I don't want to use the term, like what do you call that thing when everybody does it together?
Like a class action?
Like a class action, or is it something you were like, no, this is very particular?
Well, I mean, the issue is that, of course, when we're litigating on behalf of one particular client, it's for the benefit of that client. But we also just recognize that once we had found Haaris and we had his case, to get the county to move on it was going to benefit all, it was very unlikely that they were going to provide an accommodation for him that wasn't going to be more broadly available to other employees. So we didn't really have to go down the route of a class action. But, once we started, litigating this and brought it to the administrative agency, the EEOC, and then we brought it to federal court, there were conversations going, and this is not uncommon in litigation, right? To have sort of parallel streams of litigating, but also to be talking and trying to come to a consensus and trying to find a solution. I think there was a lot of, I think on the back end, and Haaris may remember some of this more than I do, but there's also a lot of just logistical challenges, hurdles, and sort of trying to make it work, and sort of where the money goes and how to make it accessible and how to structure it. And of course, you're in this, huge public entity that doesn't make change easily. So it did take a few years. And so the litigation went on for some time. They challenged our lawsuit twice, tried to kick us out of court to get our case dismissed. And I was able to argue against that and keep the litigation going. And then we did enter sort of a discovery phase in which, there was an exchange of information. That's sort of like the typical progression of in the typical progression of a lawsuit. And so we ended up going down that route and continuing the negotiations. And eventually the negotiations came to a place where they were willing to compromise and bring about an exemption similar to New York State.
So they actually offered to settle the case?
Generally, negotiations And settlements are often confidential, but because the LA County is a public entity, those settlements are publicly available. But there are really two aspects that we were looking for Haaris to be able to be made whole, right? One was to get this exemption, which was the option to be able to invest in both of the plans that were available to him, in a way that was at least much more compliant with his religious beliefs than the $25,000 threshold, right? So bringing that down.
So do you know what it is now at LA County?
I believe they brought it down to $500, and
Similar to New York, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Haaris can confer.
Sure.
But the other piece, of that, though, in addition to sort of what we would call injunctive relief, so some sort of solution to the problem that we were raising, is also money, right? Money damages, or making him whole from what he had lost. Now that that ended up being an interesting conversation to have, right? Because they didn't want to have to give him money. I mean, no one ever really does. But we had to basically argue that he had lost out on a lot of compensation. And to be honest with you, the math was quite challenging.
Sure.
I won't even get into that. But essentially,
Luckily, you're at Stanford, so you had many math people who go.
yes, we had other people. We kind of put the students on that. We're like,
There you go.
who wants to try to figure this out? Because there's sort of what are the estimate the gains, right?
Sure.
I mean, we had obviously Haaris had kind of indicated that his interest was really to invest in Amana funds. So we had the history of the Amana
Sure.
fund over those years, et cetera. But basically, we were able to get him a lump sum payment that actually the payment didn't go to him directly. It went to the funds, right? That were evenly distributed between the two funds.
To the plans themselves.
The plans themselves, because that's what he was looking for,
Sure.
essentially, right? He wasn't looking for some sort of cash payout. It was to be able to invest in these funds and to get back. And ultimately, what he was able to get was still a fraction of what he lost out on. But mashallah, I mean, Haaris was just so strong in his beliefs that for him, it wasn't, he lost out on it, but that was what he preferred to be steadfast in his faith and his beliefs and practice, and not engage in interest and impermissible investing, and instead, just go ahead and work. And finally, it did pay off.
That's great.
Probably almost, more than 15 years after he started as a public defender.
So, and that case that you were talking about right now with the religious exemption and also New York, is this something that can be used in other states and or federal, or is that something you can play to and say they did it, we should also, or?
I mean, that's exactly what we did, right? In part, and that in and of itself wasn't necessarily, that wasn't going to make it happen, but it's a really good argument, right? And so now we know New York State has it, LA County has it. I think, we knew that, I know that there's a lot of private employers that have options, whether that is, the brokerage window, the self-directing option, or a core fund perhaps option. I think that the New Jersey Public University system also has Amana as a core fund. So there are a lot of options out there and a lot of employers that have made this available. So absolutely, anyone who's trying to get this, option for themselves at their current employer should absolutely be pointing to LA County, New York State, New Jersey Public Universities, and all of the private employers that do this, and say, hey, if these people can do this, asking the question of why can't you?
Yeah, and from your perspective, now having gone through this, is when an employee goes to their employer and says, I really want this, is it better argument to make just give me the brokerage option and I can choose myself, or is it a better option to say, look, I want this core fund that has that in there? Because what I've also had feedback for those, I mean, when we did the study, about 250 roughly out of the Fortune 500 actually do have a brokerage account. However, that being said, there's still people who say, oh, no. If we open up the brokerage, people are just going to invest in something they don't have any idea about, and they're going to lose all their money, and then we're going to get a lawsuit on our hands. So that there is that fear amongst those others that haven't done it. So what have you found to be better?
Well, I mean, the thing about having the brokerage fund option is that it really allows for, well, first of all, if you look at New York and LA County, it's limited to people who have a religious belief, that requires that really requires them to invest in things that accord with their religious belief. And from my understanding, and this was some of the conversations we had sort of once the option had been in place, because we were in touch with LA County, it took some time to implement it all. We understand that there were people, non-Muslims as well, who were taking advantage of this option, right? People who had other religious beliefs and wanted to invest in things in accordance with their beliefs. So, of course, you're always going to have an employer that talks about, well, we don't want you to, whittle away your retirement savings. But by nature of a religious exemption, you're already limiting it to a much smaller group of people who have it available, right, to them. So in terms of reducing that threshold and making it a smaller amount, and also, I think like we mentioned before, just because you have more money doesn't actually make you a more sophisticated investor. So it's kind of based on a fallacy, this idea that, well, if we let you self-direct, well, that's already happening. People are already self-directing their retirement funds. So in some ways, sure, it does seem like there's less barriers and an employer may be more open to that. But I think the idea of implementing a core fund seems like it's a system-wide, it's kind of a more involved process. There may be a lot of stakeholders that have to approve it, and that may take more work versus the lowering a threshold for a brokerage account is a little more accessible. Now, what I will say though is I think it really depends on your employer. I mean, I don't, again, this is like my one and only Sharia compliant retirement investment litigation that I've been involved in. Of course, I learned a lot through it, but it seems to me that, for instance, if you look at, again, I don't know much about it, maybe you know more, is that if you look at the New Jersey Public University, lineup, they decided to add a monofund. So perhaps that's because they have a really large percentage of Muslims in their, as employees, or also it may be that they offer a lot of options, right, as core options. And so,
and that's what it is, right? So what they do is in New Jersey, the public school system or the universities, is that they have multiple different plans. So Fidelity, Voya, all these other different plans. And so each of these plans is competing for the employee to sign up with them rather than with another one. And so what Voya decided to do was actually say, we're going to offer these funds in the plan so we can go after the Muslim employees that are at. It was a very smart thing to do. And really, it's worked out pretty well. It took them a while, don't get me wrong, but it did end up really helping them as far as being able to promote their plan and stuff like that. So,
but that's an example of why, for instance, in that context, the core fund was really a better option. And it sounds like it. I'm not sure how much lobbying was done by employees, but it sounds like it was actually just a savvy business decision, right, to try to get more people to invest in that particular fund. So I think that you just have to, as any employee looking to do this, you have to see what's the best option, but you can also present both options to any employer, right? And give them sort of, look, there's multiple ways that you can accommodate Muslims. And the approach that we took too, even in the litigation itself, was to try to sort of say, look, the county should want to be a welcoming place to people of all backgrounds, all faiths, right? And this is a way, to not only support your Muslim employees, but also to continue to recruit, a diverse workforce. So, I think it's always best to sort of approach it from a, problem-solving, collaborative, that collaborative approach is going to go a lot farther than a sort of a more adversarial one. Of course, this is coming from the lawyer who litigated and sued Haaris's employer on his behalf. But ultimately, sometimes it does require litigation to sort of push an employer over the edge. And I don't foresee a whole lot of employees taking that route. But Haaris was able to do that for a number of reasons that we discussed before, and it was successful.
So now, and as the current plan stands right now, do they still have a very high minimum and then you have to get a religious exemption, or is it now across the board that everybody has a low minimum?
You have to ask for the religious exemption. There's a form that you just fill out and you submit it, and then it's not that it takes a couple weeks to process. That's about it.
Okay, good. And then how has it been so far in the plan? Have you gotten other Muslims or come up to you and say, hey, thanks for doing this, or have you been able to promote this to other LA County employees that this is happening?
Yeah, actually. So just to let you know, like when I first approached that Great West or, the plan administrator to sign me up for the self-directed brokerage account, and I couldn't do it. I became the go-to person. Any Muslim that asked this question to them, they're like, go talk to Haaris. And so I was like, yeah. So I would get emails from other people asking, hey, any update? And so to answer that question, some people, yes, that were involved with it or like kept in touch, they benefited from it. But oddly, or maybe it's not so odd actually, is that it's actually benefited a lot of non-Muslims, right? Because there's other people of different faiths that have actually benefited from this as well. Actually, I think predominantly it's people of other faiths that are actually benefiting from this.
That's awesome. No, I mean, just a numbers game would tell you that other people would benefit more, right? Just because of the, how many other faiths there are relative to the Muslim population,
right? But it's still relatively unknown, by the county, because the county didn't really promote it all that much. It hasn't really been advertised, although they're not trying to hide it, right? I mean, if you have to go to the self-directed brokerage account page on Empower and look at it, and then you can see there's an attestation.
You have to fill out an application or there's steps involved that are not involved in the core fund strategy. That's definitely the case. So for both of you, I can ask this question. What advice would you have for an employee who's probably facing the same kind of issues?
Well, don't give up. There's always options. When I was going through the process of like learning about personal finance, it was interesting. My brother was in his private company as a computer software programmer, and thought it was hopeless to get his employer to make an accommodation. And I said, no, they should be able to for these reasons. He approached his employer. They immediately made the accommodation, and he was able to start getting his matches. And this is before I did it for myself. And and it turned out like I talked to other people, and there was avenues for them to do it with their private employers, right? Ways to do the self-directed brokerage account for them. It was easier for them. But then I'm like, there's got to be a way for me to do it too. And if it's New York State did it, and Los Angeles County, as big as it is, was able to do it, I don't see why others couldn't do it. And New York said it was actually quite easy for them to do. And same thing for Los Angeles. It wasn't that it was hard. It was just that it was time intensive, because you need people to reprogram, their system and get all the process in place. But at a fundamental level, it's not difficult.
It's just the resistance to change kind of a thing, right? It's just a matter of
the inertia.
Inertia, exactly. So how about you, Zeba? What advice would you have?
I think, like I mentioned before, most people are not going to sue their employer, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Even if you're willing to do that, litigation is costly. It takes a very long time. I would say, number one, try to organize. You were asking some questions along this line, Monem, about whether other people kind of came on board, but I think if you're trying to organize within your company, try to get, allies, whether it's other Muslims, whether it's people of other faith traditions who are looking for similar options, right? And then approach the employer with a clear ask, with a strategy, right? In a way that, pitch it to them in a way that is good for them too, right? Obviously you're looking for a benefit for yourself in terms of the ability to practice your faith, but also receive valuable compensation. But I think making the case for why it is a good thing for them. And I know we're now in a world, this was in 2020, so then we were in a different world than we are now. And, DEI is now kind of like a bad word, and we're not really using that as much. At that time, that was our approach. But employers are still looking to, bring in, to be inclusive and to bring in great talent. And if you want to bring in good talent, there's Muslims are, mashallah, amazing. We saw it yesterday. The new mayor of New York City is a Muslim, but there's a lot of great talent out there. And basically, if you want to be an employer that they're looking at, well, this is a really great way to do that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. In doing that, and also, Haaris, from your perspective, looking back, I know you approached the LA County with the idea of, hey, these are the amount of funds, and this is the one I want, right? Would it have been better to be able to say, oh, I just want to be able to have a religious accommodation as a Muslim, or was it better for you to say, this is the amount of funds, and this is what I want in my portfolio? How did you think about that? And what do you think you could have done it better if you would have just said generally Islamic investing, or no, it's better to have one fund that you're actually promoting?
So I did both with them, right? I said, I actually I presented it as, can you make a socially conscious plan? Because I didn't want to use the term Sharia compliant or scaring me off with something like that, right? But and there was really no need to say that stuff. But that's why I took a folder from Monem mutual funds to say, look at, like, this is an option that's available if you want to just add it to your portfolio of plans. Then it's seamless. I could just invest in this one.
Yeah.
So in hindsight, neither worked. So but I think giving more options is helpful, right? I mean, then they can evaluate it and see which one is more feasible for them.
Okay, that's great. And then I'll ask on this, interesting, both of you in California, because I know California was one of the first ones, but this is being adopted in other states as well. But California now is requiring employers to offer an employee plan for even the smaller companies that are there. And that's catching on a little bit more in other states as well. And if that's the case, I mean, this is great that I was able to have both of you on to be able to talk about, like, just another way that this was done. And I do want to emphasize again what Zeba, you mentioned, is that it's litigation is not the first choice, right? But it is something that's available as something in your quiver. And really, you should go and negotiate with your employer and say, this is what we really want. You do it as a team approach with other religious affiliations, other Muslims that are there, and you go together and say, we are all looking for this kind of thing. In fact, interesting, in Microsoft, when I worked with them in early 2000s, that's what they had done. They basically worked with other religious organizations, environmental organizations, other ones to say, look, none of these options in the core funds are available or good for me. If you open a brokerage, all of the people would be able to benefit from it. It's not just one area or another. So
if I can add too, though, that the County of Los Angeles throughout has been excellent, right? They, from the very beginning, even when I approached them and they said no, they took it seriously. They looked into it. They were actually fascinated. Board members approached me in that PAC meeting right afterwards and said, you know what, we never knew about this issue. Thanks for bringing it to our attention. Let's see if we can do anything. And so they took, and then when they denied me a year later, one of them ran out to meet me in the hallway and said, hey, is there a de minimis amount of interest that's okay? And that alone made me realize, oh wait, so they're still thinking about it. So the sincerity, and people really want to help and accommodate if they can.
Sure.
And I will say, I mean, we worked less directly with county lawyers. They hired outside counsel for the litigation. But I will say, we had a great experience with those attorneys. I think that there was a willingness and an openness to working on the problem and trying to solve it. It took some time. There's inertia. There's challenges that have to be overcome. But that is not always the case. So a lot of the religious accommodation work that I did was also not only in the employment context and where there would be private employers, but also public, but also in the prison context. I worked a lot with prisoner clients, and in that context, government attorneys are not often very open to working with you and try to find a solution to someone who's trying to live their faith in prison. And so, that goes a long way. But I do think that employers and their legal departments, especially I think looking at, I think where the law is going and some of the legal developments, even what you described about the California law, I think that requires employees to invest in a 401k. Is that correct? Or
employers to offer it, and then or some kind of a retirement plan.
Okay. Well, there's that, but also just sort of the development of the standards under statutory law and things like that. Employers kind of have an increased sort of responsibility towards religious employees in order to really take these accommodation requests seriously, and to really do their due diligence and understand, can we provide this or not? And so I think what people are going to be seeing, hopefully, is that when they approach their employers with this request, that it's not just an immediate no. I mean, I think LA County did do its work, although to be fair, the arguments they presented were just not, they didn't really withstand scrutiny, to be fair, but I think we're in a world too where the law has developed to a place where employers and their legal departments should be taking these requests pretty seriously and really trying to accommodate these individuals.
Listen, Haaris, Zeba, thank you so much for taking the time. I think this has been really, really beneficial for a lot of reasons. I think it's a continuation from, we talked about the private sector and doing it one way. This has been really helpful. And I think one of the biggest things I got out of this was that, there is religious accommodation. We just have to be able to really stand up and say, I want this accommodation, and how can my employer help me to be able to get there?
Thank you. And thanks for having us. And I have to give a shout out to Zeba and Stanford Law School. I mean, absent Stanford coming in and Zeba coming in, I don't know how this would have happened.
So maybe as Zeba, after this, you can get a flood of emails saying, how do I? Are you still there at the Stanford Center?
So I actually moved on from the clinic, and so I now support a different part of the law school. But it was really an honor. I mean, representing Haaris and other clients like him. I mean, just like Haaris, you have people who come with just the sincerity of belief, right? And really just want to both be able to practice their religion and also work and make money for their family, right? It's what we all want. And so these are challenges that everyday people face on the job all the time. And the clinic, there's others like Stanford's clinic. There's other lawyers who do this work, and there's lawyers who don't focus on this but may be willing to take on this kind of work. But it is important. It is important, and it's I'm just really grateful that I was able to help Haaris, and hopefully this does also help other people within LA County, but also across the country who are trying to do the same thing for themselves.
Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you so much, Monem.
Salam. Thank you for listening to Halal Money Matters. If you like what you hear, please do rate us on the app stores and also leave us a review. It helps other people find us a lot easier.
The thoughts and opinions expressed on Halal Money Matters do not necessarily reflect the views of Saturna Capital, Amana Mutual Funds, or their affiliates. This podcast is prepared based on information Saturna Capital deems reliable. However, Saturna Capital does not warrant the accuracy or completeness of the information. We do not provide tax, accounting, or legal advice to our clients, and all investors are advised to consult with their tax, accounting, or legal advisors regarding any potential investment. Investors should not assume that investments in the securities and/or sectors described were or will be profitable. Investors should consult with a financial advisor prior to making an investment decision. The views and information discussed in this commentary are at a specific point in time, are subject to change, and may not reflect the views of the firm as a whole. All material presented in this publication, unless specifically indicated otherwise, is under copyright to Saturna. No part of this publication may be altered in any way, copied, or distributed without the prior express written permission of Saturna Capital. Performance data quoted herein represents past performance and is no guarantee of future results. Investment return and principal value of an investment will fluctuate so that an investor's shares, when redeemed, may be worth more or less than their original cost. Current performance may be significantly higher or lower than data quoted herein. Performance current to the most recent month end can be obtained by visiting www.amanafunds.com or by calling toll-free 1-800-728-8762. Please consider an investment's objectives, risks, charges, and expenses carefully before investing. To obtain this and other important information, which you should carefully consider before investing, about the Amana funds in a free prospectus or summary prospectus, please visit www.amanafunds.com or call 1-800-728-8762. The Amana funds limit the securities they purchase to those consistent with Islamic principles. This limits opportunities and may affect performance. The Amana funds are distributed by Saturna Brokerage Services, member FINRA/SIPC, and a wholly owned subsidiary of Saturna Capital, investment advisor to the Amana funds. Securities mentioned in this podcast episode. The Amana funds do not hold any securities mentioned in this episode.